So the first thing was, it was an intriguing title, The Age of Austerity. And the first idea that came to mind for me was, in a sense, I know that we're referring to very recent times, but for me, thinking of my time as a student and starting to teach and to practice architecture, that it's almost always been an age of austerity for me, for us, I think. Now, I was very lucky as a student to actually, to begin to learn architecture at the universities at a time when these great people, and I'll mention, two specifically, both Leon Creer and Stefano were really working hard to teach architecture and to push forward actually very brave ideas and very novel ideas. And I'll tell you the truth that I for one bought into them right away. For me, it wasn't there was a common sense, there was an intelligence, and there was an embedded wisdom in what these people were saying and teaching. That for sure I needed to learn more and to do more. And then fortunate in that my education at the University of Miami was in fact, a byproduct of these great ideas, and I was fortunate to work with Elizabeth Plater-Zyberg and Andres Duani to sort of further reinforce, and at a time when, in fact, the ideas of the new urbanism, the kind of love for traditional architecture was I know it had started a bit before, but for me at least, I think at the time it was starting. And so I saw in these architects a kind of love for architecture that really was infectious. And I also saw that they were actually learning it themselves, just the way that they would explain things. And so for me, it was just a wonderful experience. The image that you see here, I'll explain further, but it's actually, it's the very first project that we did independently, and we use it on our website, and I'll let you know what next. And then, so what I'm hoping is to tell you a very quick story, but especially for the students, for you to, I'll tell you some of the thoughts that I had as a student, as a young architect, and see if somehow they make sense or I can bring it together. As a student visiting Siena, and there were very many important moments, but visiting Siena for me was something very special. And it had to do with two moments. And one is, again, something that I'll show you in a bit, which is Lorenzetti's fresco, The Allegory of Good and Bad Government, which is in the city hall, in the Palazzo Pubblico. And it's really one of the fantastic works of art. My students tell me I love to talk about painting, and I do. So hopefully you can put up a little bit with that as well. Next. And then the second in Siena was, and honestly, walking down the street and all of a sudden seeing that tree, which is still there, this beautiful tree just sort of growing out of the fabric of the city. And for me that was a special moment, because growing up, in Miami, which is a special place, but it's a very young city, with many suburban parts and so forth. It was just beautiful. It was a moment of there's the sort of landscape I grew up with that I understand, but in this incredible place built by humans out of stone and so forth, it was just an amazing moment for me. And looking at painting as I was traveling, the delicacy of the expression of human production is what always attracted me. Next. And so I found myself, and we found ourselves, looking at references. This image is a bit light or hard to read, but a wooden stair within a masonry body, or a building, with these great balconies in St. Augustine. And again, just remember the image, and hopefully you'll see how I make the connections, and because memory is important. Next. And so that first house that I'll show you now is here in this village called the village of Tannen by Duany and Plater Zyberg. And here's an image of a house, of a second house that wasn't actually built until recently. It's actually amazing for me to say this, but the house and the projects that I'll show you here are close to 20 years old. But for me, this was a bit of a reflection, so I thought, it'd be interesting just for me to think back on these. And so this tiny village of Tannen, roughly closer to a quarter, but a third of Seaside, is a town that followed right at the time of Seaside, after Seaside. Doesn't have a property on the water, but it was the idea of making a neighborhood. And I'm so lucky that the truth is, on the slides, I'm going to go very quickly because I think in a wonderful way, everything that I wanted to show you in a sort of didactic fashion has been covered. The truth is, just these folks have covered all of this, so it makes it very easy for me, hopefully, for you to buy into some of this. Next. And so this house, with a very humble and simple plan, and these are the two owners, really was just a wonderful moment. And what we wanted to do was just a simple little wooden house, a simple little wooden bungalow. And our office in Miami's a young city, but our office is in a little wooden bungalow from 1921. But the architecture in America from the teens and the 20s is actually pretty good. It's not outrageous, it's pretty good, it's humble. And so it's not really the same, but suffice it to say that what we were looking for was one small space, that the living room is at the center of the house, that everything revolves around it, and that the constituent components of the street, the small dooryard, the porch, and the main body of the house, that was it. That was all that we needed to accomplish. And so you see the plans, and just very simple. Thanks. And so what we learned eventually was that the relationship in American small town urbanism, the architecture has a great responsibility, like in all city design. But in American design, the role of the fence, and in some cases the porch or the facade, there's a kind of extension of the public realm that the architects really have to deal with a lot. So the truth of the matter is that it's a difficult thing to negotiate. And it's very different than, quote unquote, European architecture, where, the facade is on the street and the right of way is tighter. So I'll show you some projects that, luckily for us, that we've worked on that work both ways, and actually, in two cases, American architecture as well. American architecture that's even more like European architecture. Actually, can you go back one? And so this is a screen porch, and the screen doors are very important because those are, there's a gate at the picket fence, and then there's the door of the screen porch to enter, the first room of the house, which is the porch. Copper screens, and then what we call the fish scale siding. The idea that you're by the water and that the cladding is somehow like, the natural life of these creatures that live in the place. The owners, next slide. Remember, this is not on the water, but they were buying a lot and building a house here because they wanted to be by the water and see the water. So we just thought, well, this humble little belvedere, for them to be able to go up to the little guest room, you know, to look out to the ocean, that was it. So we were very happy to do everything and anything to be able to deliver this. Now, there's more that I can talk about, because we were just learning about wood construction, framing, how to put things together. But the most important thing is that when, you know, it's important to think of a building in plan, but, you know, like all the great works that we've seen today, I don't know if you all have noticed, but I have seen just beautiful ways that buildings meet the sky and ceilings. You know, it's so important to look up, and, you know, architecture lies within that. Next. Next. And then down the street from the house, we also had the chance to do a little pool pavilion, a little pool house. So really, it's a threshold in this kind of American small town. Next. And the kinds of drawings that we were making. And we were using craftspersons, builders from Alabama. So a building in brick, true wooden columns, like barrels, built in sort of an American tradition. And you see early American architecture, and you see these beautiful columns that they're like barrels, just the way that they're crafted with the wood is just so amazing. And I had a chance to, you know, to see those. We had a chance to see those and study those different places in the United States. Next. And so it's a form of gate, propylea, a way to go to the pool. We thought of it as a little face, a kind of creature, but we wanted it to embody the idea of porch, of entrance, of threshold. And so there it is again. Next. Next. And then on the other two sides, because right behind it is a forest, is a preserve. So you see the beautiful pine trees in the background, but the two sides give on to neighboring sites. So in other words, someone can buy this lot. So we actually put the quote-unquote the nice side of the fence to the neighbor. So when someone builds a house there, they actually have a fence which is dignified. And that was our way, humble, well, Austeridad. That was our way of saying, well, you know, we all live together and we share things and ideas. Nice. And so then there was the village of Windsor in Vero Beach, Florida. So if you look at the work of Duany and Plater-Zyberg, this was another place after Seaside, which now graces actually buildings by Leon and many wonderful architects. But essentially, it's all about new urbanist ideas, place-making values, and so forth. Next. And we had the good fortune of actually working on using the courtyard typology, a tiny little courtyard building, two little tennis cottages. It's tennis cottages because they're in front of the tennis center. And then a house at the town center. Now, these were actually the smaller, tighter lots that the developer wasn't even sure whether they should make them bigger, not do them. You know, perhaps, certainly I know Steph, I know Maria and Pedro now deal with those kinds of issues. By the way, when you were showing the dwellings, there's something about where people dwell, the notion of house in a larger sense, that always sort of touches me. And it was just so beautiful to see those beautiful, you know, the project in its entirety is so wonderful, but the dwellings are amazing, you know. And so at any rate, so these tiny little houses, we were kind of the lucky ones who get the hardest thing to do. So we tried our best. Next. And so the courtyard building has a tiny little courtyard, 3 units, 1, 2, 3. There's alleyway and parking, where there's an interesting little entrance, from the service side or the main entrance off of one of the greens. And again, it was an experiment with, back then, or at this time, in the United States, making a little courtyard. Steph could tell you how difficult it is to pull that out, because there isn't a recent tradition of doing this. Next. And so you see how the plans are fairly simple. Next. And again, in the character, this is a place where I don't know how to speak to character as much here, because Windsor, there are these early new urbanist projects, and it's about bringing in this kind of identity. And for us, I guess it was, and with the ideas behind the makers of the master planners, this notion of St. Augustine, but a kind of both Caribbean, Hispanic, or what I call the sort of Anglo-American architecture, that we were sort of searching for, how one can do this. But at any rate, here's our attempt with masonry ground floors, wood second floors, openings that had windows and transoms for generous light and ventilation, and then an accentuation of we took great pride in thinking about these attachments of how a balcony, how these would work. Next. And so you see, the kind of elaboration that we went into. Thanks. But the truth is that it was the court that was very important to us. So the courtyard, with all the units, so you enter the court, and then you enter the units. That was just very important to us. It's courtyard typology, enter the court. Again, paying attention to floors and ceilings. Next. But actually it was this that we were. So I show you floors and ceilings because it's about this notion of, in this kind of environment, in this kind of weather, in this climate, and how wonderful these spaces could be. Next. And we were very happy in the end with these courts and their little gardens. Next. And so the tennis cottages, very tall first floor, raised just a bit above the ground, but the great balconies, now these by code had to be thinner. But, so we were looking at, again, these traditions in the Caribbean, of great places like La Habana, San Juan, where you find actually these kind of slender, different proportions on these very thin balconies where you can put a chair and basically just put your feet up on the rail. And that's what people do. So this is what we tried. And up here, we made it extra tall because you had to look over the fence and the hedges to be able to see the tennis matches. So that was the impetus. We actually had to ask for permission to make the buildings a little bit taller. Next. 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 Sorry. And and in some cases exposing the metal. Next. And so, one type of balcony, another type of balcony, with bracing and cantilever. The small one cantilevered. The big one different. Details. Next. So then a house at the town center, which, by the way, well, it's on a curve. Next. These were all spec houses. These were not for an individual client. So this is a developer asking us to do the work. It makes it different. But it's simple houses with the ideas of the courts. But for us, the responsibility here was to hold the corner. Next. And actually, the body, you don't get right angles. But the goal in the composition was that it would just seem like, a kind of pure form sitting at the corner. Next. And then we looked at we had actually the good fortune of traveling to Rio de Janeiro in Brazil and seeing some of the older, some of the authentic architecture of the place, and looking at the structure of the roofs, las cubiertas, and thinking about, so how different than how we saw it in America, but also with these great extensions. Next. And then the idea of the little wooden balcony, of the little wooden cantilever, all real. I mean, all construction that is real, that's connected, that's integral. Next. And so you enter in a kind of funny way, but it was done purposefully to kind of force the idea of looking up and thinking about different ways of moving water and so forth. Next. Then, finally, a private client asked us to do a house here, actually overlooking a lake. And so what you're looking at here is the carriage house or the garage. I'm not going to show you the whole house. Again, based on the courtyard typology with an auto court. And again, thinking of ceilings and beams and columns and how they could be expressive. Next. But what they wanted, in this case, to make the 2 rooms upstairs habitable, we actually needed that balcony as a main circulation piece and to make the rooms good. So in this kind of climate where that's the way you get to the rooms. What was happening at Windsor at the time is that architects were building these cantilevers that they were just simply pouring concrete. And to be honest with you, and Liam, it's not because you're here, but I didn't like it. I didn't like it because it was too much. So we struggled with, well, can we do something in between? A little bit of concrete and then the wood, and to talk more about the material and method of construction and to make it a bit more human, I suppose. Next. So this is so here we kind of we're exaggerating the expression. This is as funky as we get. Next. 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 Next.
It's a cantilevering machine.
It's a cantilevering machine, with some strings attached. So here's what's wonderful. So I put this together, and because the sort of Vitruvian triad, firmness, commodity, delight, and Samir talked to you about this, and Ettore talked to you about. Everyone here, spoke to you about this idea. I decided to bring these 3 images because these are places that, if you look at them, and yes, they're World Heritage Sites. Why? Type, character, and the culture of building. The culture. See, Samir, I don't know, would be saying to me, wait, Frank, it should be type, character, and style. Same thing, I suppose. I don't know. This is what we're thinking about. But at the center, is Toledo, and any one of these, you can judge the architecture that you make and the ideas that you propose by these commonly held beliefs, this kind of wisdom. Next. And then this was a slide given to me by Andres Duani, and we were talking about the notion of environmentalisms, or these different forms of environmentalism. And we understand the notions of preserving the natural landscape, but what about this, which is the human habitat, the human ecosystem, as it were. And this is something that the new urbanism, and I think inspired by Professor Creer's teachings, has actually spent many, many years looking closely at what that is. Next. So I go back to Siena and Lorenzetti's fresco. In this case, you're looking at the allegory of good government, and this is in the main chamber, where decisions are made, where the citizens, in theory, of the town come together to make decisions. Next. And when I talked to Andres about it, I said, Andres, the allegory of good government is analogous, or is in fact an older form of transect theory. And it's transect theory, why? I don't need to explain this again because Stefano already explained it to you. But here, again, we see from pure being out in the landscape to, within the neighborhood of the city, from natural environment to completely urban, very urban, it exists here. And there is a health that's being displayed here, a concern for human dignity, a concern for the planet, that's amazing. So you all can see this in Siena. You can actually go there and look at this. And what we see is travelers to the city. We see a countryside where it's healthy because there's agricultural production. There are other little villages and hamlets out in the landscape. And when enters the city, there are defined edges. And we see the life of the city in a very beautiful way. Next. And in that room, on the other side, is the allegory of bad government. So people refer to it as the good city and the bad city. Now the bad city, here are the evil folks. I won't get into a long discussion. But we'll see the landscape and the city next. And so the effects of bad government, when we look at the countryside, we actually see little hamlets, as it were, ablaze, on fire, destruction, ruin, disrepair, sort of not caring, and there not being patronage of the place. Next. Whereas you juxtapose that to a healthy environment where people can actually travel and share ideas, again, in a safe and wonderful way. Next. And so the architecture is in disrepair. Next. And here, the architecture is actually continuously being improved. Next. Continuously being thought about. The great notions of how to build a roof. Next. Next. Classes being taught and trade happening. Next. So, what Selena was talking to you about, the sort of latest and most horrible form of suburban, and again, you already heard the lectures on that, juxtaposed to a kind of humble notion of American small town. Next. And then just a quick thing on this notion of human health. And in this case, thinking of Maslow, thinking of psychology, and his theory, which are these stages for human health, physical and mental, but this is from a psychologist's point of view. But at the base of the pyramid is the physiological. That means we need to eat, and we need, all of the normal things. Safety, that one needs that. Belonging. And then this we label here within the sort of good life, that you need to build. I mean, you can't go hungry, right? And you can't be at war. And, you need to share for there to be an exchange of ideas, culture, community. And there needs to be a continuation of that to get to what Maslow thought as the highest form of self-actualization. Now he, as all psychologists were doing at the time, thinking about the individual, eventually you have to tie this to a theory that is about the collective. Next, next, next. So all I'm really saying is that if we think of this, that all of this is really cogent. That even if we look at the human being as an individual, and we think about transit theory and how we deal with the built environment, that we can actually get to, and in order for people to actually to get to that highest level of that pyramid, maybe the greatest expression is in fact civic art, which is the making of cities. So I could go back to those three beautiful places. Next. And then just a reminder of Vitruvius telling us what we need as architects. So I've simply highlighted, because you've been taught this and we've been thinking about it. Next. But everything that Vitruvius was saying is somehow contained in this, the School of Athens, by Rafael, the great architect, painter. This you can see at the Vatican, within the Vatican Museum. And what's beautiful is that within the framework of the architecture, and Rafael, at this point, was the student of Bramante. And Bramante was his mentor. Bramante was encouraging him to be an architect. And so Bramante is working on St. Peter's. And there's an implied notion of the Bramante St. Peter under construction, as we see here. But it's the School of Athens, and it includes all of the great minds and thinkers to that point in the Renaissance. And yes, Maria, Plato and Aristotle at the center. And importantly, that's actually Leonardo da Vinci attributed to him, his self-portrait. So Raphael uses his image and paints him. And there, thinking profoundly, is Michelangelo. And here's Bramante being placed in the drawing as Euclid. Next. So Vitruvius tells us that we have to have knowledge of drawing, geometry, optics, cost. And again, in all the lectures you were hearing this. Next. And so that's what I mean by that painting by Raphael gives us an architectural history and talks to us about our ancestors, about these great architects and artists and thinkers. And it's all about this for Leon. Next. But somehow it's so difficult to be an architect because you have to bring all of this together somehow. And I want to tell you guys that if you derive inspiration, as I have, from what you've seen these past 2 days, these are folks that are really trying, these are people that are trying really hard to be this, to get to this point where they're producing works of architecture that have meaning in this way, that can be left behind and that can teach. Next. So all I say is that if we look at Vitruvius's 6 principles of architecture: order, arrangement, symmetry, eurythmy, economy, and propriety. And economy and propriety, you heard a lot about in the last couple of days. Or if you jump to, as William Westphal tells us, the next great theoretician or treatise on architecture, and you take Alberti's Elements of Architecture, which are more, if I can say this, I may be wrong, but more concrete. Although, in a sense, these principles are broader. And the idea of locality, area, compartition, walls, openings, roofs. If you take both and you use them to analyze buildings objectively, that is a wonderful way of thinking about if what you're doing has value. And, well, a little bit about beauty. So, I won't go through them. Next. But very important, because even in the notion of propriety, Vitruvius actually tells us to select healthy, healthy neighborhoods, or make healthy neighborhoods where there is water. So you heard about that this morning. You heard about the importance of the elements. And, eastern light, western light, northern light for picture galleries and other places in which a steady light is needed. And this is about physiological needs that human beings have that Vitruvius understood. Next. And then economy, that Professor Creer was telling you about. Next. And I just bring this in because the last presentation about the patrimony of Spain, and in a sense you were challenged by Stefano today to think about that. But really we heard today a lot about this notion of genius loci, or the spirit of place, which can also not just being phenomenological, but actually being concrete, that it has representations, as we saw earlier from Fernando, right? That this, and then for me, the notion of dwelling is incredibly important. So dwelling implies something more than shelter. Next. And that environment does influence human beings. And so that we don't want to miss out on, concrete environmental character of the place. That means really thinking about materials and methods of construction, or the symbolic nature of a landscape, of a silhouette, of human-made, the human system, and not just the quote-unquote natural environment. So this is a beautiful painting by Alma Tadema, which talks to us about the flower market. So I just simply call your attention to the shop front, the sidewalks, the implied placita or piazza, and the beautiful variation of flora that can be found in a place like Rome. Or in fact, Alma Tadema is actually, I'm not going to get into that, but he's also playing tricks where he's bringing plant materials from the New World back to ancient Rome. But did you know what that means? I mean, with what you've heard here today, yesterday, you know what the implications of that are. Next. And then the theoretician as well, Viollet-le-Duc, really, he made a book, The Habitations of Men in All Ages, where he searches for this notion of dwelling, human beings throughout the ages and across culture, how they dwell, how they live, the architecture that's made for them. Examples of some of his work and drawings. Next. We were talking about seismic construction. Now, a lot of this, Viollet-le-Duc is taking liberties. It's sort of scientific research and a little bit of invention, but the book is a bit of a novel. And I can only say to you, have a look, because it's a great read. It's a kind of historical fiction on the part, but the drawings, next, are quite interesting, because he does look at the buildings in a sense typologically, but it's important the kinds of drawings that he makes. Next. Everything from, quote unquote, the primitive hut to next, to an Ionian house. But so beautiful, the sort of, again, the behind the types, the embedded architectural ideas that are transferred culturally. Next. An Athenian house or a Greek house. Next. or a Hindu palace. Again, the concern has to do with section, light, ventilation. Next. And so we did some little study again for developers in the project in Costa Rica. But I show this actually just more to talk about the passion and the love of drawing. Next. So from idea, conceptual sketches to really sort of thinking about topography. Now, we did this in a master plan, and we were hired as architects to test ideas for a master plan. We were not designing the plan or the stated urbanism, but trying to support it with the architectural project. Next. So 2 examples on different sites. Next. Next. But then next to Seaside, in a place called Alley's Beach, I wanted to show you some of these images because it's a beautiful new urbanist plan that's very clear about its block, lot, and the width and arrangement of streets that we've heard about. But interesting, like Seaside, it's a plan that in the end, the streets, and this one has an alternating rhythm of pedestrian streets, vehicular streets, pedestrian streets, vehicular streets. But all of these streets, even from back here, like Seaside, somehow, even if you build a building here, you are connected to the ocean. So one of the genius of the plan of Seaside, to me, has also to do with taking advantage of its location, the locality, as Alberti would say, to make a plan that's masterful in the creation of places for people, but that in the end actually delivers, the ocean to the entire town, to the entire city. Next. And so one of the projects there that hasn't been built yet. Next. And I'll show you 2 that have. This house with its tiny little courtyard in the state of not completion yet. This one, which is an infill courtyard lot here. Next. So you see how it's a body that wraps the corner with a main body of 2 stories. One method of circulation in the open gallery, and then a second stair that's within the body of the house. Next. With slightly more completion, the stair in the gallery. All of this is in fact true, true wood construction, wooden beams, real connections, and so forth. Next. Next. And here we are with students through different phases when I have the opportunity of visiting these places. Next. And again, always paying attention to ultimately the what I like to think of as the ornamental program of the building. Because there's not a lot of ornament here, but there's some. Next. The main doors. Next. And then the smaller one on a 40-foot lot. Next. And in this case, we wanted to experiment with the little loggia. So not a balcony coming out, but actually a loggia in a sort of proper European sense within the body of the building. And here we see it obliquely. Next. And the little courtyard, which is really this. That's the opening to the sky. Next. From the upper floor. Next. And then, so I really wanted to show you two projects that are about restoration. I mean, this is a historic building in Massachusetts in Martha's Vineyard, which is an island off of Boston. And this is the Old Baptist Church in Martha's Vineyard that had been, built in 1853 and then changed its use over time. And when the current owners bought it, it had already been transformed into a house. And they wanted to restore it, but again, use it as a house. It was a bit of a challenge, but what a joy to work on such a beautiful building. I wish I had images of Edgartown, which is the oldest town on Martha's Vineyard. It's just a spectacular. It's the northeast version of Key West. So it's like Key West, Florida, but in a not so tropical environment. Next. And so the facade, as we prepare drawings for restoration. Next. But so of course the church was a box that had a choir loft, and actually originally, even though it wasn't the original stair, had a stair that crossed in front of the window on the main facade. So a Greek revival temple. And the family, so our challenge was, how can we not lose the sense of the great space of the church while making it basically a summer house, and being able to house lots of family and extended family and have all the practical programs. So what we did is, you see this is all open to the main ceiling, and that's the primary new stair up, which gets you to these bedrooms off of these little lofts, bedroom, maintaining the old choir loft stair. And then, so these are the kids' rooms, and for visiting children, so I always said, and their children are little, so I always thought that on the choir loft you would have the little angels when they're there in the summer, driving their parents crazy, singing to them below. Next. And so so all of this is new construction. But our idea was that the interior, that one can still feel the presence of the old building, but that somehow now it's a family house, and the great height of the space, the choir loft, the windows around the perimeter, which are triple hung, American, based on Georgian English examples of windows that slide up and up. So we were able to lace the second floor, literally passing in front of the windows. And this is a building being on an island that has no air conditioning. And the clients didn't want it. They wanted to live in a more natural and fresh way. And it works. It really works when we have the opportunity of visiting, especially in the summer. And part of the idea of the cross ventilation is that we looked at actually examples like I'll show you in Boston, but also Caribbean examples of systems of enclosure, from transoms to windows to operable louvers. And one can find these in Havana, which I actually consulted with old Cuban carpenters on how to build these properly, but then had people on the island build it. Next. And so the section is really about, the way that we thought about the project is that there was that you enter the house, and that the center is almost like a little piazza within the house. And so when family is there, visitors like us and the rest of the family, that you can actually talk to each other from the other side, but the parents can still connect all the way around without having to go up and down. Next. So that was part of the idea, You may not have noticed, but each of the bedrooms has a bathroom that you can actually make the room private, but still allow the bathroom to be used by other people in the house. So you literally could have 4 or 5 families living, staying there for a great sort of escapes onto this great item. Next. And then, of course, we redid the tiny little garden and the facade where we improved the basement and we added these trellises. Next. A view of the house up front, the garden facade. The garden is no bigger than this. Next. So details of the new pieces. Next. Next. This is under construction without completion of its picket fence. Next. Next. And so here we see the fence, the family going out for a bike ride, and sort of lounging under the trellis. Next. And then this house, which is in the city of Miami, it's in Miami, and it overlooks the intercoastal. So on this property, which kind of gets you, but when you're there, you actually see across to Miami Beach. But it's in a suburban, it's in a neighborhood outside the city center. And I can't say much about the urbanism of the place. So in this case, we try to make a house that learns from these other places. So we have to kind of make it its own interior little urban experience. Next. And the sort of final execution of the plans from an auto court, an entry through an atrium, which I'll show you, which really re-centers you and then re-centers. Dining room at the center, kitchen, a dining loggia, family living room, and all of the family rooms above. So this is actually the little garden forecourt, which you're meant to actually only arrive at later. So it's a kind of terminus on the way out. Next. Next. And so the little atrium as you enter. We basically just took a pot that we found that we loved and created a little base for it. Next. 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 And so the last thing is in Boston, for the same family that owns the Martha's Vineyard project, they actually purchased a townhouse in the city. And so here are this is a beautiful painting by Edward Hopper that talks to us about the sort of American urbanism with the fabric of the city when it's primarily, which often is, dwellings. And we see Boston under construction, or the new extensions of Boston, meaning Back Bay. Next. And so here we see, this is where Boston, the old Boston Center is. And that which is Back Bay is this extension that we see here. But we see how the river really, came into what we now know as sort of part of the city of Boston, the extension that we think of as the old city, but it's the new city. And I'll explain these further next. And so from 1640, Boston, the North End, the center of Boston, where the Boston Commons is now. Next. And so here we see current Boston, the great public gardens, and it's really from Arlington Street out to the west, and on Commonwealth Avenue, that we get in the in the 1840s, the extension of Boston out to everyone who goes out there now would say out to the ballpark, right? Cambridge across the way. And so the house I'll show you is here on Beacon Street, built in 1861. Next. So some images of the church across the public gardens. Next. A beautiful rendition of Boston. And again, what I'm going to show you as the growth of Back Bay happens here. So the river, literally, this was a receiving sort of marshy land on water. It's a bit like a Venetian project, actually, what happened with the extension of Back Bay. Next. And here we see the steakhouse, and portions of Beacon Hill were taken down to fill and to extend the city. And so again, here you see before and as it begins to grow, right, up to 1871. Still, all of this was stuff that was still underwater. The machines that were bringing gravel from nearby towns. Next. For example, in Needham, the gravel pits. And then, so here's Boston proper, and here are the public gardens, and here's the extension. Next. And as it grew, there were also landscape projects like the Esplanade, which is part of what you see today. Next. So this is the Esplanade and the extension. Next. And here we're seeing the public gardens, and this is the extension of Beacon Street. And what really happens is that all of this fabric, these wonderful blocks, next, with these houses that have very thin faces, literally 18 to 24 feet. The one I'll show you that we worked on was a 20-foot frontage. Basically modeled after the examples in Paris, Haussmann's extensions of Paris with the boulevards, with these houses on multiple floors. Next. Faster. Next. And so you get this block structure with main streets, lots, and alleyways. Next. Based on these examples from Paris. Next. And then here we see photos, mid to late 19th century examples. But this is a prototypical, and most of these were actually built by builders who would speculate, who would build maybe 2, 4, 6, but it was small incremental growth. Next. And so here are examples that are 18 feet wide. Next. And the system for construction was actually wooden piles driven deep into the ground, below, literally, or going into the water table. So here's street level excavation, and so wood piles with granite blocks, leveling blocks, and then stone foundations with masonry, with brick masonry party walls. Next. And the typical houses, whereas this, usually buildings that try to get light from the front and light from the rear with some form of core. Next. So you would get primary stairs and then secondary stairs that run through the house. Most important was this relationship of facade to section. Next. And this is the one that we worked on. It was one of 6, but we worked on one. It's okay, go forward. And so one enters on a stoop. So the way that it works is that there's a basement level, which is a kind of split level. There's level 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Next. And I'm just going to ask you to read through I'm going to walk you through the house. So at the basement, this is the basement level, right? And then the main, or the first floor of the house, which is not the main floor, because the main floor is actually level 2 that has these great salons. You know, one being dining and one being living. And then the chambers, the rooms, work off on top of that. Next. So just to show you more clearly, here you can move down to enter the basement, which we actually had to redo and lower the level to make it habitable and to develop the courtyard space connecting to the garage. And then here we see the first level, so when you go up the steps, you enter and you see the primary stair, the kind of reception room, primary stair. The original kitchen was actually in the basement, in these old houses, either in the basement or out back. The owners actually wanted it on the first floor. Next. So coming from the garage at the back, this was the space of the court, which we added a gallery to. Next. So it connects garage to main house and the basement level to the garden. And we, therefore made a special stair to get down to that. Next. And here we see the section in all its glory. So garage, basement level, step up to main. So this is the main stair that gets you to the second level, which in Boston, that's like in some Parisian examples, that's like the piano nobile. And what we discovered, if you go one back, is that there was this beautiful light shaft that comes through the building, next, that we actually saw in a historical house and documented, and all of this becomes important. Next. Next. So that what we noticed was that the fenestration on the south side of the house, the street face, actually has the thick wall with single windows, but what they call the Indian shutters built into the wall system, because you can control light that way. So this is where you get lots of light, where you get summer breezes, and so you can open it up, an elevator into the building. Next. Next. So the fifth floor is for guests, and then we developed a head house, or a way to get to the roof terrace. So this was new, and we had to struggle with the Historical Society to allow us to be able to do the roof garden. Next. Which one sees here, looking over the Charles River, coming out in the evening. Here's a plan of the roof garden. Next. Next. And so here we are at the roof garden, looking to the south. So this is all of Back Bay, where some of the more recent taller buildings have happened. Next. Or looking over the Esplanade, Cambridge, MIT, and so forth. Next. And that's it. Thank you.